The subcommittee will come to order. Good morning and welcome to today's CITI subcommittee hearing. The hearing really seeks to answer two fundamental questions. What is Replicator and can it work? How can it work? The Deputy Secretary of Defense announced Replicator's expansive vision in late August, which is to field thousands of all-domain attritable autonomous systems. So what is that, A2, this is what my biggest problem with A2. I finally got A2AD in my head, and now I have to think of a new acronym here. But to field all-domain attritable autonomous systems within 18 to 24 months to combat the Chinese Communist Party's greatest asymmetric advantage, which is sheer mass. Now, it's 2 months later. That would be 10% of the way through the 18-month timeline. And this subcommittee, the Armed Services Committee more broadly, and industry, I would argue, including small and medium-sized innovative companies seeking to supply our troops, who would presumably be part of Replicator, and the American people are still left without any details on Replicator. What is necessary to make it successful, whether it is feasible, and what counter effects it seeks to offer to counter Chinese military capabilities. Now, I agree with the Deputy Secretary that the threats we face warrant a revolution in the defense industrial base, expanding the number of supplies, reducing fielding timelines, scaling production, and modernizing the culture of acquisition across the armed services. And though a small part of my soul dies every time we enter a new acronym into the DOD lexicon, I want to be clear. I want this to work. I think we need to be moving heaven and earth to enhance near-term deterrence across the Taiwan Strait. Otherwise, we may stumble into a war that would make the current conflicts in the Middle East and Eastern Europe look small in comparison. So I want this to work. And in fact, someone gave me this book yesterday, which I never read and I haven't finished yet. It's a small book, though, so even I, as a Marine, can read it. It's called Men, Machines, and Modern Times by Elting Morrison. Dr. Greenwald seems to know this book. It's the 50th anniversary edition I hold in my hands. And thus far, what I can deduce is that he kind of talks about this process of innovation and resistance to change and kind of identifies a cycle of resistance that involves really three stages. The first is ignoring. The second is rational resistance. And the third is name-calling. I want to be conscious of not falling into this cycle. Obviously, we're holding the hearing, so we're not ignoring Replicator. Though I worry about our ability to deliver on the timeline, I'm not trying to resist just for the sake of resisting. And as for name-calling, well, we already have the name for the initiative, so I'm not going to denigrate it. Again, I want it to work. I want to work with the building, and we're lucky to have a group of experts from outside of DOD to get their candid advice and perspectives on the challenges and opportunities presented by the Replicator initiative, and the general theme which we can all rally behind, which is procuring more hard power faster. We're joined by Mr. Brian Clark, the Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, Dr. Bill Greenwald, the non-resident Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and Dr. Paul Shar. Am I saying that right? Yeah. Did I get that right? Shar? Shar-Ray? Yeah. Okay. Okay. We've had any number of discussions in person, and I still have trouble with your last name. Executive Vice President and Director of Studies, at the Center for New American Security. This is an amazing lineup of people. I'm really looking forward to this discussion, and with that, I will turn it over to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. Like each of you, I've followed the department's Replicator program, and I commend the chairman for holding this hearing and the briefings that resulted because of the hearings. I think it's important for the department really to brief Congress about what this program is and why we need it, what the obstacles are. As I've often said, briefing Congress is like briefing the American public. So the American public needs to know in simple terms what is exactly the Replicator technology, what are our goals, and how are we going to achieve them, and by when. As you know, advanced technologies alone don't ensure effective capability. A new system hinges also on contracting, management, a committed industrial base, and being backed by training units and robust support functions. I'm particularly interested in our industrial base's ability to support the Replicator program and where there may be vulnerabilities in our supply chains, and want to hear what continued challenges you face and how this committee can help in ensuring that you hit your goals. To each of our witnesses, thank you for lending your expertise. And Mr. Chairman, I look forward to this discussion.
Thank you. Mr. Clark, you are recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Gallagher, Ranking Member Khanna, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting us here to talk about Replicator and, by extension, DOD's other unmanned system initiatives. Congratulations also on getting the DOD to actually start talking about Replicator and what it might be, because this hearing has led to a series of conversations that we have had, both with the DOD and with others about the initiative. So Replicator, is pursuing a worthy goal. The initiative is trying to, solve operational problems being faced by today's operational commanders, so combatant commanders, and trying to, do that in a way that leverages new technologies. It has a lot of the elements of a successful quick-turn technology development program. We just did a study for the U.S. Navy that looked at this, and Replicator has some of those elements built into it. But I'd say that there's a few things that it's missing that it really will need to address in order for the program or the initiative to be successful. First of all, it's kind of aiming at the wrong problem. So the idea of using mass alone to be able to counter China's mass is probably not the right solution for the U.S. China, as a resident major power, we're going to be operating in their backyard. They can generate targets at a lower cost and more easily than we can generate successful shots on targets. So if we are going to try to match mass for mass, we've probably picked the wrong adversary, the wrong scenario, if we're thinking about an invasion of Taiwan scenario. So what we need to do is think about not just using mass, but using our innovative, more creative operational capabilities. So just like Secretary Hicks mentioned in the announcement for Replicator, we need to enable operational innovation on the part of our warfighters. Their creativity, their ability to generate new concepts and force compositions will allow them to undermine China's planning ability, create uncertainty for China, degrade the ability of concepts like system destruction warfare to be successful. So we can't just rely on mass alone. Replicator, especially in its first instantiation, which they call Replicator 1, it should be aimed at something other than mass. It should be aimed at enabling operational innovation. Then that kind of suggests, well, what was the process by which they analyzed the solution set that Replicator 1 may pursue? And that kind of brings it to question, what is the Replicator Initiative's design in terms of how do they analyze potential solutions, come up with them? And I think that's a weakness of the effort thus far, is they don't have a strong analytic background for the initial solution sets they're pursuing. We're doing a study right now with Australia's DOD, and this is one of the areas where they actually seem to have an advantage in the U.S., is they've got a very robust way of analyzing potential solutions, both looking at gaps and potential opportunities for asymmetric advantage. So not just trying to fill holes, but also looking for ways that can create problems for an enemy. This is an area where Replicator could improve, by looking at a better way of doing the analysis. And if we want to be able to gain warfighting advantage, the biggest challenge that Replicator faces, and that they aren't really addressing it, I don't think, is integrating unmanned systems together in ways that are going to enable them to communicate with one another, be managed by a command and control system, and then operate in a way that creates creative operational concepts for us to pursue and dilemmas for enemies to deal with. So Replicator is going to have to create a process that allows the software of the vehicles, the software of a command and control system, and the networks that are connecting them all together to interact. The government's going to have to manage that. This is not an area that DOD has particularly been good at, and the current way that Replicator envisions doing this is by having DIU buy vehicles, hand them over to the services, and have the services pursue this integration. As we know, DOD doesn't do a great job of integrating between services or between domains, and so that's going to create the challenge of integration and then maintaining that integration through successive changes to operational concepts and tactics that we're going to want to pursue if we want to create continued dilemmas for China to have to deal with and deter their aggression against an ally like Taiwan. So, overall, I would say Replicator has good ambitions. It has a good goal of solving near-term operational problems faced by commanders, but in its implementation, it's going to have to make some changes that start aiming at the right types of objectives, not just mass, but looking at ways of enabling innovation that creates dilemmas for an opponent, and then allowing for the integration that's necessary for unmanned systems and the existing force to work together to create those force packages, those concepts, those tactics that are going to undermine China's ability to be successful. If we don't do those things, then we're simply going to create more of the same and make our own force bigger, but not make it any more difficult for the Chinese to defeat. Thank you very much.
Clark, Dr. Greenwald, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Gallagher, Ranking Member Khanna, and other distinguished members of the subcommittee. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning on DOD's Replicator initiative. I ask that my written statement be part of the record. So to answer the subcommittee's question about whether the Replicator program can work, I think one first needs to figure out specifically what it is and then establish criteria for success. I'm not really sure yet that any of us or even the department can articulate how and with certainty how this concept will evolve. Still, I think there's enough information out there to say that deploying thousands of cheap autonomous sensors, weapons, communications nodes, and targets that serve as a deterrent and can complicate Chinese and other potential adversaries' calculations in a future conflict is probably a pretty good idea. In that context, the Replicator-type drone program has the potential to be a significant game changer and may well be worth pursuing, but only if it's done correctly and does not crowd out funding for near-term munitions and other critical requirements given the current rising threats around the globe. An even better idea that's coming out of the Replicator initiative and embedded in this initiative, and the one that's probably really most radical, is to eventually replicate the business processes necessary to eventually achieve rapid time-based innovation and operational deployment over a much wider portfolio of technologies. Replicator proposes to be a vanguard for a massive and I would say much needed change in how the department innovates at scale. Each of the initial stated Replicator goals, the short-term drone deployment and then the medium-term business development process change, face significant challenges. The issue for Congress to consider is whether any of this is realistically achievable. I think it could be, but the odds at the moment are pretty much stacked against success. The biggest challenges revolve around DOD's culture and processes. DOD's culture and the management systems derived from that culture are stuck in a 1960s paradigm that has consistently rejected new approaches and commercial technology incorporation that does not conform to DOD's ingrained thinking. The greater defense innovation problem is multifaceted and one that manifests itself in the extensive time it takes to deliver capability. The system is based on a planned, step-by-step predictive process that takes decades to deploy anything of substance. This is diametrically opposed to how DOD used to develop capabilities in the 1940s and 1950s, and how things are done today in the commercial sector. It should come as no surprise to this subcommittee that the vast majority of technologies that the Department of Defense needs in the future reside in the commercial marketplace, which has adopted a time-based innovation system and not in the Department of Defense or in the traditional defense industry. DOD in the 1950s essentially created the time-based innovation playbook that was the basis for Silicon Valley's subsequent success. And Replicator is perhaps one last chance for Silicon Valley to return the favor and reinvent DOD. I say all this because the lesson from past DOD innovation efforts is that if Replicator is not taken outside of the acquisition budget bureaucracy and rules, it will fail. The Pentagon's acquisition system is simply not capable of acting on the proposed timelines contemplated in the Replicator program, except in very limited circumstances and then only when conducted outside the normal rules of acquisition and budgeting. This committee and its sister committee in the Senate gave the department 8 years ago a new playbook to create a time-based innovation and acquisition system. It had created production other transactions, improved commercial item procurement, enhanced rapid acquisition authority, a new middle-tier acquisition authority, all designed to bypass the cumbersome acquisition and budgeting processes. The results to date have not necessarily been what we would hope to have seen. Older bureaucratic mandates, particularly within OTAs and MTA authorities, have restored the ability to achieve the successes that I think Congress was looking for at the time. I expect Replicator will face many of the same problems in trying to implement these authorities as it tries to move forward. I don't think it's hopeless. It's a fight worth fighting. I think it can be successful, but it's something that DOD needs a lot of work and a lot of top-down direction to do so. I think this model is much needed, and the stakes are really high to implement it. And so I hope they can achieve some success. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify and on this topic, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Greenwald. Dr. Shar. Did I nail that?
Perfect.
Okay.
Chairman Gallagher, Ranking Member Khanna, distinguished committee members, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Replicator has a bold agenda to field thousands of attritable autonomous systems in 18 to 24 months. This effort is not only valuable, it is necessary if the U.S. military is to reverse its decades-long death spiral of rising costs and shrinking quantities for major weapons platforms. The United States will need large numbers of low-cost attritable systems to generate the mass necessary to prevail in a conflict with China. We've seen in Ukraine the scale of violence that is possible in an interstate war and the possibility that such a war could drag on for years. The level of casualties seen in Ukraine would render the U.S. Army combat ineffective in a matter of months. The U.S. military will need expensive capital assets, such as aircraft carriers and stealth bombers, but it will also need low-cost, uncrewed systems to bring greater mass. We have also seen in Ukraine the value of such an approach. Both Russia and Ukraine have flooded the skies with low-cost drones to find and track ground targets. Ukraine is reportedly losing 10,000 drones a month, yet it is able to reconstitute those forces using cheap, commercially available drones. This is a way of fighting with mass that the U.S. military does not have in its current force, but it is a part of U.S. history. In World War II, at the height of production, Allied factories were producing over 3.5 times as many tanks and airplanes as the Axis powers. Today, the war in Ukraine has strained the defense industrial base's capacity for munitions production. For the United States to be ready for a conflict with China, it must be able to produce forces at greater speed and scale than it has done to date. Replicator is a test of the Defense Department's ability to generate the types of systems it needs, in the quantity it needs them, and at the speed required to deter China. The Pentagon's bureaucracy is likely to face challenges along all three of these dimensions. Low-cost, attritable systems and autonomous systems are both paradigm-busting concepts inside the Defense Department. They have supporters, including the department's current leadership, but they challenge the Pentagon's traditional ways of doing business. DOD will also be challenged to move at the speed that is required. Even if DOD succeeds in its goal of fielding thousands of systems in 18 to 24 months, by then at best it will be 2025. Replicator is an important step, but it is one the department should have taken a decade ago. Speed is now essential. We saw in Iraq and Afghanistan that the bureaucracy can move quickly when needed. DOD rapidly fielded ISR aircraft, counter-IED technologies, and MRAP vehicles. Yet each case required direct intervention by the Secretary of Defense to circumvent traditional processes that were too slow and were not focused on urgent needs. Similar senior-level attention by department leaders will be required for Replicator to succeed, along with congressional support. The DOD has had recent successes in breaking the mold and moving quickly. The Defense Innovation Unit has brought in commercial technologies in a matter of weeks and months, not years and decades. But too often, these innovation success stories have been small scale. To field thousands of systems, DOD will need to operate quickly at scale, something it has often struggled to do. Replicator is essential not just because of the capabilities it aims to field, but because of the path it is blazing through institutional red tape. Speed and scale of acquisition and new warfighting paradigms will be needed not just for autonomous systems, but across the force if DOD is to transform itself rapidly to counter a rising China. If successful, Replicator can train the institutional muscle memory inside the department, not just in the Pentagon, but in industry as well, to move quickly, experiment with new concepts, and scale production. Is it possible? The average time from program start to initial operational capability for major defense acquisition programs today is 11 years. Yet the United States mobilized for and fought the entirety of World War II in only 6 years. The United States can move faster when the moment demands it, nor are these episodes confined to our distant past. Just recently, during COVID, with government support, U.S. industry rapidly scaled vaccine production to produce over 100 million vaccines per month by the end of 2021. Despite repeated warnings, the U.S. defense establishment is not on a war footing today. Replicator is a chance to change that dynamic, and congressional support will be essential for this vital effort to succeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First, I want to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement from the Association for Uncrewed Vehicle Systems International. Without objection, so ordered. I also want to note how it feels a little bit scandalous to be holding a hearing in the absence of a speaker, but I kind of like it. So I'm glad we're doing this. Okay, so let me confess that when I first read the speech announcing Replicator, my rational resistance kicked in to the effect of, well, if we're going to do a crash program in the next 18 months, let's replicate the existing systems we know we need in the Indo-Pacific. Long-range anti-ship missile, SM-6, JASM, JADM, NSM, right? Like the critical munitions, the long-range precision fires, we know we need to be moving to maximum production rates of, but we're still at minimum sustaining rates even after the collapse of deterrence in Ukraine. So now my concern is that how do we accomplish Replicator without crowding out other programs if they say they don't need new money for Replicator? Put differently, my biggest concern is that particularly when we know that the administration tends to prefer RDT&E over procurement, is that hard power programs like munitions are going to end up being bill payers for this, and I worry about that trade-off. So maybe I'll start with Mr. Clark. Can you comment on that? Is that concern valid?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you think about where they're going to find money in the near term to be able to reallocate towards, procurement of vehicles. It's going to have to come from something that's relatively fungible, and munitions are, any pure procurement account is a place you can go to get that money. So something that's not got fully obligated funds will be a source of money for Replicator. So that's a concern, and I think to your point, we need a combination of both the continued maximum production of long-range precision munitions, but we also need what a Replicator can bring in terms of creating a more recomposable and more flexible force structure that's able to create some dilemmas for the Chinese that are separate from what the long-range fires complex can do. Because they've planned for and are dealing with, in their systems destruction warfare, our approach to long-range fires. So more long-range fires is just going to make us better able to continue doing business the way we do now. So we've got to also have what Replicator provides in terms of more flexible and creative operational constructs that are going to create dilemmas for the Chinese. So we have to do both, and I agree with you that money cannot come from Peter to pay Paul.
Yeah, and the spirit of the question is that this shouldn't be an either-or choice. But if you were going to say to the SecDef, okay, something can only happen in 18 months with SecDef level involvement and pushing the bureaucracy every single day, and you can only focus on one thing, I would focus on long-range precision fires, right? I mean, that is something you could make meaningful progress with SecDef level involvement, and we're just not moving fast enough. Maybe Dr. Greenwald, comment on this point, but also perhaps tie it to the need for flexible funding that in order to achieve Replicator's goals. You've offered extensive commentary on the use of expired unobligated balances at DOD and the Defense Modernization Account.
Yes. No, I mean, the potential of crowding out other critical needs is one of my biggest concerns about Replicator right now. And I think we need to basically take existing systems that we need in Indo-PACOM and ramp them up. And I think your recent proposal legislation in the Fires Act is exactly what's needed to basically harvest money at the end of the year and put it into production ready assets in the munitions industrial base. Funding flexibility and innovation is absolutely critical. Right now, there are very few pots of money that the department can actually use and move around in the year of execution to essentially focus on things that look like they're going to be something that we can scale up. In other words, what happens now, and Paul has talked about 11 years to achieve capability, that's from program start. Right now, it takes almost 8 years to get to the decision and get money to start that program. So it's 8 plus 11, so it's really 20 years that we're talking about. One needs to be able to start a program, get on contract, and get money within a year of execution. That's the way we did it in the 50s, but that's not the way we do it today. So these various funds, whether it's the Defense Modernization Account, which Congress tried to create a decade ago and has not been implemented by the department to basically harvest about $1 billion to focus on unanticipated requirements in MDAPs. It's very difficult for the department to want to execute and use flexible funding for whatever reason.
I'm going to have to come back in a second round. But I want to foot stomp this point and highlight a lot of Dr. Greenwald's analysis, which suggests that over the last decade we've lost hundreds of billions of dollars, $127 billion in buying power, money that was appropriated to DOD and not spent. And then it goes into Cinderella land, abeyance for 5 years in the Treasury, and then it evaporates. For example, we lost $11 billion a few weeks ago, in part because, not just because of intransigence here in Congress among certain committees, but also a lack of enthusiasm from the building and the comptroller's office. And I think it would be wise for us to take advantage of that money, which is, again, going to disappear and be used for non-defense purposes in order to provide sustained, predictable funding for both long-range precision fires and potentially Replicator. So help me help you, DOD. We want to give you this money. With that, Mr. Khan is recognized.
One of the challenges and vulnerabilities of democracies is that we're openly critical of our own systems. We would never have the Chinese discussing whether their systems work or are strong enough. I guess my first question is, how much of a deterrent effect is just the announcement of a Replicator program and that we're doing this, putting aside, obviously, that we want to do it successfully?
Well, so I would say that there is a dissuasion effect. Maybe if you think about this from the Chinese perspective, they're looking at, what are ways that the United States is going to present new challenges to us that we have not prepared for. And this would be an example of that kind of challenge. This, along with what Admiral Paparo talked about recently in terms of wanting to create a hellscape, in the Taiwan Strait to help thwart an invasion of Taiwan. If you put those together and say, the U.S. could be fielding large numbers of unmanned systems with the intent of orchestrating them in ways that are going to defeat or at least slow down our ability to rapidly invade Taiwan. That starts to maybe undermine their confidence in their ability to mount that invasion. So yeah, there's an effect that starts to chip away at the confidence that Chinese leaders might have about their likelihood of success. But you got to follow it up, right? Because then it'll abate. So you got to follow it up with some actual tangible changes that are going to continue to drive that uncertainty, and then you're going to have to evolve it over time. So it can't be just we sent out a bunch of these unmanned boats and now they don't, they do the same thing year after year. You got to continue to evolve them. And I think that's one of the challenges for Replicator is to present an evolving set of capabilities that are going to be forced dilemmas on the Chinese.
Yeah, certainly there's nothing like seeing for believing, and so obviously Chinese military is going to be tracking what the DOD is saying, but I do think the DOD needs to think strategically as they move forward about doing demonstrations that can demonstrate capability in ways that are going to have a deterrent effect. We've certainly seen this in the past. Several years ago, DOD did a big swarm demonstration out at China Lake with 100 drones. That was followed not long after by China doing their own swarm demonstration. We know that's the things that they're watching, and so there's going to be a lot of capabilities we need to conceal, but some that we want to think about strategically showing for a deterrent effect.
What then, if we convene a year from now, as I'm sure the chairman will, do you think are the, let's say, top 3 things we want to have seen by then to demonstrate that this is a success, both internally and in what we're projecting to the Chinese?
I think deployment of capability. In other words, to actually have had programs with capability that are out in the hands of the warfighter, who then are suggesting new improvements, and we're making the next level of changes that are necessary. I think you have to show that you can actually deploy capability fast and in such scale that it makes a difference.
I think another thing is having a rapid tempo of prototyping. You know, the DoD does prototyping now, and that's one of the things they want to do with Replicator. But if that tempo is like 1 or 2 exercises a year, that's not going to cut it. The DoD is going to have a more rapid pace of prototyping in order to both assess a variety of potential solutions, but also change those solutions over time. And if we don't see that in a year, then that's an indication this is kind of going the way that other programs have.
I think one of the things that we've seen in the past with new technologies like this is finding out how you use it effectively is one of the most difficult things. So integrating this rapid prototyping, getting it in the hands of the warfighters with a tight loop between warfighters and developers so that they're figuring out how to use this most effectively is going to be key.
And Dr. Greenwald, I read in your testimony about the defense industrial base, and I've been concerned about that. I was surprised that the DOD didn't track exactly where all of our component parts are made. And we had an amendment in the NDAA this time just to say, where are our vulnerabilities? What are we getting from China? What are we getting from other countries? Do we know with this program what our vulnerabilities are, and is there an effort to make sure that we have a robust defense industrial base?
I think that's a question that the Congress needs to continually ask. I've talked to a number of drone manufacturers who would like to scale up, and they're looking at their supply chain, and a lot of that supply chain is not American or even allied. And that's going to be a real problem when you try to scale up. And the time to actually get those parts and into the United States is going to be a delaying factor in achieving their objectives.
First up is an Alabaman, an EMT, and a Price is Right contestant, Mr. Strong.
Thank you, Chairman Gallagher, and witnesses. Thank you for being here today. And my questions are for each of you, just whoever wants to take it. Through Replicator, the Pentagon is committed to fielding thousands of attritable autonomous systems within 18 to 24 months. We're not talking about just research and development or a small-scale pilot program. This is a large undertaking. And the speed of it, all within 2 years. Don't get me wrong, I agree there is an urgent need for this type of a program. But I'll take Huntsville, Alabama, for instance. We waited on Space Command basing decision for more than 2 years. When we came in first throughout the entire process, and the Biden administration still chose the 5th most qualified location. Now we're working to fix that, but there are countless examples of programs and procurements being held up by protest and general delays. My point here is that the DOD is not exactly known for being speedy, as they are claiming they can implement Replicator with no additional funding or authorities. So my first question is, do you see challenges with the DOD implementing the Replicator program based on current funding lines and existing authorities?
I would say absolutely. But this committee has given in the past the department ways to achieve those objectives if they so use them. So the first one on funding is the Rapid Acquisition Authority account, which would allow for rapid reprogramming and then congressional notification after the fact. This has been a very useful authority ever since 9/11 to get capability in the hands of the warfighter faster. Other transactions, which is a contracting authority, allows the government to get on contract quickly. Could be 30 days versus and without protests. This was very successful in many DIU efforts, and frankly was how the Falcon 9 was created in NASA. So you have that. The middle tier acquisition authority is a way to move around the cumbersome requirements and an acquisition process, which adds years to the process. So there are tools they could use, but if they use the traditional ways of doing business at the Department of Defense, it will take decades to achieve this capability.
Dr. Greenwald, do you think that the Pentagon has identified and begun addressing these challenges?
I think the Pentagon, parts of the Pentagon have. There are a number of innovation hubs that are taking advantage of this authority, but as Paul has pointed out, it's not at scale. And so the Pentagon needs to focus these authorities laser-like on programs of scale to bring these capabilities as fast as they possibly can into the warfighter.
Thank you. The DOD can't do this all on their own. It's been made clear in the last year that our defense industrial base has atrophied. Is industry ready to scale up to meet the needs of the Replicator program?
I would say not yet. They need the investment in order to be able to make the kinds of investments on their own that they're going to need to be able to build up the facilities. Because right now, DOD's investment in unmanned systems has been pretty anemic, which has led industry to sort of back off and keep their powder dry, waiting to see if that demand is going to start to manifest. And so as a result, we don't have an industrial base right now to draw upon to scale at the type of pace that Replicator is envisioning. So it's going to take some time to make that happen, even if we take advantage of emerging technologies for manufacturing.
Thank you. Are there any previous autonomous programs of similar scale that the Replicator program should take lessons learned from?
Well, we've certainly seen other attempts by the department to scale quickly with commercial technologies. You mentioned protests and delays, and I think it's worth pointing out that some of the challenges, in addition to those inside the department, exist outside of the department. The JEDI Cloud Computing contract is an example of the department trying to do this. And when the department is using sort of small-scale innovation solutions, small money, they can do that. When you got to a $10 billion contract with real money on the table, then we saw protests and lawsuits that mired the entire process in 3.5 years of delays. And so I think that is a big risk when we start to see scale.
Thank you again. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Next up, a product of Pennsylvania and the United States Naval Academy, Mr. DeLuzio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. I want to ask about several non-defense AI autonomy organizations, Google and many others, who've now adopted codes of ethics, saying they're unwilling to support the use of their technology in defense, for defense purposes. So I'm curious, maybe from each of you, whoever wants to weigh in, to what extent are you thinking these principles impact DOD's ability to accomplish goals like those set forth in Replicator? And these are ostensibly American companies, I should note.
Yes, thank you. We saw, I think, a big concern by those in Washington, in Congress, and in the department several years ago when Google did not continue their work on Project Maven. I think one of the things that we've seen since then is that while there are some companies that have said they don't want to work with the military, in fact, we've seen a number of major tech companies stand up and say that they are American companies and they are going to work with the government, with the U.S. military, despite, in some cases, protests from their employees. We saw the leadership at Microsoft and Amazon both say that. In fact, Google is now working with the Defense Department again. So, and we've seen since then a huge growth in startups that are specifically oriented at the Defense Department as their customer. Shield AI, Anduril, many others. So I think in practice, this has been maybe more noise than substance, and in fact, just a huge segment of the tech community that's eager to work with the U.S. military.
I think even the biggest problem that some of these companies face are not necessarily related to AI ethics, but are related to how the government does business, how the government treats intellectual property, how the government contracts, the non-unique commercial processes that each of these companies has to create to comply with having a government contract. That's why other transactions and other means of having a commercial type contract is important to these type companies, but something that the Department of Defense is not exactly stellar at using.
I'll just add one small corollary to this is that the new rules for the use of autonomous weapons that the DOD has put out are going to force Replicator to think through some really complicated mechanisms for command and control of these unmanned systems that allow them to meet rules of engagement requirements and allow commanders and operators to have a chance to make a decision whether a system is going to be used in a lethal manner or not. That's not trivial, and it's going to require Replicator to have some longer-term effort to do the software integration and the updating of these systems even after they're fielded.
Thank you. Dr. Ringwell, I want to come back to something you said about intellectual property. That was my next question, so thanks for predicting it. Look, several of these systems that are in DOD's inventory, government does not have intellectual property rights. So I'm curious if you want to start and if others want to weigh in, what should be DOD's strategies here around intellectual property for systems like the ones we're discussing, where because the DOD may not have those rights, it can't grow and learn and gain insights from the systems that otherwise might be able to.
Intellectual property in contracting is an incredibly hard subject. And the department needs to, ahead of time, understand which IP it needs to maintain and operate systems, and which IP it doesn't need so it can incentivize not just a monopoly provider, but an entire ecosystem of competition and then systems can be replaced based on that. That is a very difficult process, but at the same time, it's something that the department needs to become the expert at. Because it is so important, because it incentivizes industry, but it also is a barrier to the department using its own things that it's bought. So I think it's definitely one of these things that the committee is going to have to continue to shepherd and look at.
Any other thoughts from the panel?
Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
I mean, I think there's just on IP and maybe more broadly, a genuine tension for the department in moving fast versus having the right procedures in place, having ideal contracting structures or requirements for systems. And to some extent, if you're controlling for time, as the department's trying to do here, there may be situations where you're purchasing something that you're not going to sustain over the long term, and that's okay. And I think that we should acknowledge that that's fine, because that goal of we're going to buy something that we're going to keep for 20, 30 years is the enemy of moving quickly.
And one other thing is the government can exert its rights to own the interfaces or to manage the interfaces between software, and a lot of this intellectual property has to do with software. And the government can allow companies to provide their own software and develop that on their own, but then force them to show that they can integrate through the interfaces that the government owns in a way similar to what iOS does with new apps trying to get into the App Store.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Next, a salty Marine infantry officer from Salem, Massachusetts, Seth Moulton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ukraine has done remarkably well at holding off the Russian bear, in large part thanks to our help. And yet all their most innovative warfighting is not from us, because we didn't help them, innovate with drones. We didn't help them innovate with cyber. We're just trying to teach them tactics that America learned 50 years ago. So what lessons are you taking from Ukraine's drone program to influence how you get Replicator up to speed so quickly, as it clearly needs to be done?
Well, I'd say one thing right off the bat is Ukraine's been able to do what they're doing, not through necessarily just mass and throwing a lot of unmanned systems at the Russians, but instead it's how they orchestrate, how they organize themselves, how they use the tactics that the unmanned systems enable, how they employ those tactics in the field, how they basically sequence their operations. So it's a lot of the kind of operational art is what they're bringing to bear that's actually yielding success, rather than just throwing a bunch of mass at the wall and hoping that the Russians get overwhelmed. So I think the lesson there is we got to figure out ways to enable our unmanned systems to be employed in a very flexible way that tactical operators can then adjust in the field.
But what about from an acquisition perspective?
Right.
I think that what we're seeing there is that the proliferation of commercial technology is influencing how an agile acquirer, and the Ukrainians are being very agile in this, of pulling together various commercial technologies to achieve military significant means. And I think the lessons learned that we should be taking from there is that the commercial marketplace is maybe light years ahead of where the Department of Defense is, and we need to figure out how to be agile and bring that in, and then bring the unique military knowledge that we have to bear on that commercial tech. And that is going to be a process that moves against the Department of Defense's culture.
Well, I would just suggest you also consider that, at least my understanding of how much of this is working in Ukraine, is they're taking their DOD personnel, their military personnel, and actually embedding them in the companies, as opposed to what you just said, which is taking the companies in and bringing them into the bureaucracy of the DOD. I think we can all intuitively know which one would probably produce quicker results. So I think we should look very carefully about that. And honestly, look, Kath Hicks came out in, I think, the end of August and announced the start of the Replicator program. Just in terms of timeline, because speed is so important here, and we all agree on that, at what point will Replicator have the capabilities of the Ukrainians?
I mean, certainly not on any timeline that we're currently on. I mean, even if they achieve all of their goals, we're looking at Ukraine is fielding tens of thousands of drones on a regular basis, and Replicator doesn't even have that goal. So that would be years away. One of the things that we've seen from an acquisition standpoint, Ukraine do very successfully, is they have a very decentralized approach. They have civilians, sort of like spontaneously working, drone operators, working with industry, working with the military. There's downsides to that. They have a very heterogeneous fleet, so things like maintenance is hard. But if you're losing them at high volumes and you're focused on replenishing, that's fine. And one of the advantages of what they're doing is not only can they then scale through that direction, but they do a lot of experimentation in the technology and then how it's being used, because they're allowing a lot of freedom among those on the front lines and the developers to try things and figure out what works.
Well, does anyone know what percentage GDP Ukraine's is compared to ours at this very moment? I don't know either, but what I intend to do is write a letter to the department requesting a basic chart that simply compares Ukraine's speed of fielding, acquiring these technologies, acquiring and fielding, getting them in the hands of warfighters, compared to Replicator. And we can come up with some basic metrics of how to gauge that. But that should be a basic yardstick. I mean, I would say that if Ukraine's GDP is 1/100th of ours, then we should be 100 times faster. But be that as it may, let's at least just compare one-to-one how we're doing in terms of speed. I think that would be a great metric for how successful this program is. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Next, from Norwood, Norfolk, and Nantucket, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and your efforts at alliteration are wonderful this morning. The sailor from Salem and whatever. Thank you very much for holding this hearing. I just have one kind of overall question that's maybe you could shed some light on for me. Number one, the idea of a swarm of drones or low-cost decoys overwhelming an opponent, an enemy, that's a pretty old concept. It's been around for a long time. So my question is, why now? Has something changed? So this is now something we're going to implement. And how is the Replicator different than these old concepts?
Why now? I think I'm not entirely sure what's driving the department. Certainly, the China threat is one that they are focused on and trying to move quickly. We also can see quite clearly in Ukraine that a lot of these concepts are working. And this idea of low-cost, attritable autonomous systems has been a very contentious one in the defense community. It's not new. It's been around for at least the last 10, 15 years. People have been talking about it. But right now, we're seeing that it works. Like, you can build large numbers of low-cost things that are not individually survivable, and yet you can replenish them quickly, and that is effective in delivering combat power. And I think that kind of real-world demonstration doesn't hurt.
Yeah, has the technology changed that much?
Yeah, I mean, what we've also seen in Ukraine has exhibited that is that the commercially available vehicles have been, very effective. We've reached a point where they can be operationally useful in a military sense. So you can get large numbers of them very quickly into your forces' hands. On the software side, we've been able to manage them and control them in ways that are going to be more effective than just having a swarm go and try to overwhelm the enemy. So I think on both the kind of hardware and software side, we've seen technology evolve in a way that allows this to be an effective military capability. And then to Paul's point, the military threat right now, the potential for an invasion of Taiwan by China has gotten to the point where our traditional approach to dealing with that problem is not necessarily going to be as solidly effective as it has been trusted to be in the past. And so I think that's the other thing driving this, is that the operational urgency is there.
I also think it's a desire for the department to create a new innovation model. And drone technology is a segment in which they could actually do that. They're essentially, you can argue, already doing that with space assets and the commercialization of space, and so that's a successful model that they can replicate in Replicator, and autonomous drones are kind of that next level, but there probably are a couple other technologies that they could pursue as well.
Great. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Okay, I'm going to entertain a second round. In my opinion, the only thing better than producing mass quantities of long-range precision fires, ideally with advanced energetics inside of them, is doing so in concert with our closest allies, particularly the Aussies and the Brits under AUKUS. As you know, autonomous attritable weapon systems and technologies are a key part not only of AUKUS, but the National Technology Industrial Base and many of our bilateral agreements. What needs to happen with our allies and partners to build out our magazine depth in this regard? And I'll just go, I don't know who, someone want to volunteer?
I'll start with that we need to incentivize the working together of the scientists and engineers in not just the government, but in industry in the three AUKUS countries. And in that regard, there is a need to reform our export control and our ITAR process. Right now, that process designed to protect technologies that unfortunately now are many generations old are keeping our best scientists and engineers from working together to solve these problems. And even to the point where Boeing Australia created a new loyal wingman drone that's ITAR free. Why? Because Australia itself wanted to have sovereign capability and the ability of not having to go every time they use that product to the State Department for approval on how to use it. So we have to reform our export controls to incentivize that structure.
That's a starting point, clearly, and to build on Bill's point, Australia is concerned that if they provide the Ghost Bat to the U.S. military and then the U.S. military modifies it, then the Australians will not be able to get it back because now it'll be ITAR controlled. So there would be a version of Ghost Bat that we use that's maybe more sophisticated, and the version Australia has is still whatever baseline. So that's a concern that they had that they raised to us when we were down there for the study we completed. I'd say the other big thing is the scientists are all working together. We talked with these guys, and they're very interactive right now. But there's not a demand signal for buying the systems and fielding them and doing the experimentation, because right now there's no experimentation venues that are across all three allies where they're actually looking at prototypes of these systems being employed in real operational settings. We need to create that and have a pretty rapid tempo of that. And then we've got to create a demand signal in terms of investment, whether it's the U.S. making the investment or all three countries making the investment that's going to draw these capabilities across the finish line into some useful operational form, or else industry is never going to start ramping up the production.
Dr. Shar, any thoughts?
These export control barriers are killing us. And the Ghost Bat example is a painful one. And we can't, the problem is we're not going to be able to get to the things we need to be doing, working jointly with them, developing concepts of operation, if we can't do the basics in terms of sharing the technology. Those are things at the starting line that are really holding us up.
And also, at the most basic logical level, if the problem is PLA mass, they can produce a lot of stuff, and we can't sort of counter that one for one, then the logical thing to do would be to assume risk and work with our partners and allies, which is our asymmetric advantage, right? They don't have allies and partners. They have vassal states and...
Right. Create complexity for them, create uncertainty, multilateralize the problem, make it more difficult for China to feel like they're going to get a free shot at a place like Taiwan.
Yeah.
But our allies are moving out. So, for example, not just Ghost Bat, but Ghost Shark, which is essentially a commercial unmanned submersible that's going to be take commercial technology from actually the U.S. and the Australians are going to militarize it and try to flood the zone with a lot of autonomous undersea drones. That's huge. But the U.S. Navy should be working together with the Australian Navy on that concept and on those cheap, undersea attritable drones, so to speak. but we're not.
So in the Navy's defense, they are working together on programs like that, and I think programs like Ghost Shark are a great example of how commercially derived technology can sort of circumvent these ITAR regulation limitations. But I think again, there's no prototyping environment for them to go and actually go play with these things, and there's no demand signal to buy them.
But I'd argue the Navy is also cognizant of the fact is that if it does go in on Ghost Shark, it ruins it for the Australians and ruins it for them because they will be ITAR'd.
Clark's contractually obligated to defend the Navy. He's a homer. So, okay. I probably can't ask this next one in 25 seconds. Okay. Well, I'm going to do a third round anyways. So, yeah. But do you want to ask a question? Yeah.
I just have one
Okay.
question.
I'll yield to you and then.
Yeah, my question actually builds off what the chairman started out with, which is that we obviously need NSM and we need SM-6. We need these long-range anti-air, anti-ship missiles. We also need the drones. Obviously, we need everything in some way, but how would you prioritize in terms of what is more urgent when you have limited resources in the allocation?
Well, I'd say that we probably need to take some money, even if it means cutting into some of the munitions programs, and get these drone programs up and running, because this provides a hedge against that kind of high risk, maybe low probability potential of an invasion of Taiwan. So if we can give Admiral Paparo what he's talking about in terms of a hellscape, even if that means we maybe don't buy 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 additional missiles, that may be worth it in order to get this hedge going and be able to create the potential for China of a more complex situation in the Strait, instead of adding kind of more of the same in terms of the fires network that we're already thinking of employing against that kind of force.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't think that the kinds of strike munitions that we need in this conflict should be the bill payer for this kind of effort. And certainly we've seen historically that because of the flexibility in production, that munitions are often a bill payer when you're looking for near-term money. My colleagues, Dr. Stacy Pettyjohn and Hannah Dennis at CNAS, have analyzed, sort of by year, the rapid volatility in munitions funding that then has strained the industrial base and has directly led to the situation we're in today when we try to scale munitions production for Ukraine or for deterring China. We're at a difficult place. But there are lots of other places that are bill payers in the department, in ground forces, in legacy short-range TAC air, and lots of other things that are not going to be as relevant in this kind of conflict.
Have you seen any innovative efforts on containerized fires from DOD? Recognized
yes.
for an unclassified?
Yeah, yes, I have seen them. I don't know if we can go into detail on them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, in the testimony that I entered into the record from the Association for Uncrewed Vehicle Systems International, it lays out that the U.S. currently lacks the industrial base needed to meet the goals of Replicator, in part due to Chinese drone dumping, an illegal trade practice that's been flooding the global market with subsidized Chinese-manufactured drones. It's estimated that Chinese drones account for more than 90% of the consumer market, 70% of the enterprise market, and 92% of the first responder market. What steps can the United States take to revitalize our domestic drone manufacturing industrial base in order to help Replicator? I'll go reverse here and start with you, Dr. Shar.
Well, certainly this is a problem DOD has been working on for a while with the Blue UAS program, trying to find ways to build up some kind of domestic commercial base. Part of the problem is even if you have drones that are made here, all of the supply chain comes through China because the drone is in essence, in many ways, a flying smartphone. So I think that this particular problem is embedded into a much bigger problem of the U.S. tech relationship with China, deep degrees of entanglement, and finding ways to put in place incentives for industry to be moving production elsewhere to partner or allied countries is going to be really important.
I think we missed an opportunity in this technology, not from the Department of Defense standpoint, but from the regulation of the FAA as far as encouraging the type of testing and development of technologies and to open the airspace to do this. From the Department of State, whose interpretation on missile technology control regime that led to not companies investing, and frankly, the Turks taking certain marketplaces and the Chinese taking the market. So we had, we developed this technology. We were ahead 30 years ago, and now we're not. And it's going to take a whole lot of effort to try to overturn that. But it's a multi-governmental agency effort. It's not just the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense can't drive this technology and drive the industrial base. It's going to have to come from other agencies' help as well.
Yeah, I mean, it requires supply chain transparency. We need to do the analysis to figure out, well, what are the components that are coming from China, and what's the risk associated with that? Because batteries, for example, are going to be probably inevitably going to come from China, and we probably have to accept that. But other things maybe we don't want to have come from China. And then also, creating that demand signal on the part of DOD for drones that are in this, like Bill said, the Group 2, Group 3 size range, where it's not your little DJI hobby drone, but it's like a TB2 or something like that that's militarily relevant. Creating a demand signal for those drones from the DOD will kind of force some of these controls to be put in place and help the emergence of a more stable U.S. domestic drone making market.
But we're also going to have to export to our closest allies. And because our demand alone is not going to drive this market,
Yeah.
so we need to share, and that's going to be goes back to the State Department again.
Yeah, and ITAR specifically, yeah. Well, I'm cautiously optimistic we can fix ITAR in this Congress. We're making progress for the first time in a while, and I want to commend the efforts of Chairman McCall on the Foreign Affairs Committee. It's a very fraught issue. A point of clarification. Okay, so Replicator is going to be coordinated through the Defense Innovation Steering Group, DISG, another acronym, with the support of DIU. And we have great new leadership at DIU with Doug Beck. Just tell me how do the combatant commands fit in, and the services, or how should they, rather?
So the way that innovation is being managed right now in the department is the combatant commanders, in particular INDOPACOM, is driving the definition of operational problems to be solved. So that's the entering point, is they provide the operational problem they want to address. That goes into the Defense Innovation Working Group and Steering Group, and then they make decisions about prioritizing which operational problems to solve in which order.
Okay.
And then that goes over to then the kind of vague solution identification process, and that's what I was referring to earlier. It's not well-defined, not well-supported necessarily, but then DIU is part of that, and then will generate solution ideas. And then DIU is responsible for going and procuring those solutions to get them to the warfighter.
Interesting. Any other comments on that basic management structure?
I mean, I guess just we've seen this problem of this gap in the ability of the department to respond to COCOM needs over the last 20 years. It's not a new one. There's been a lot of organizational solutions, JUONs and GEONs and other things. We'll see if this works, but I think that there are just huge structural barriers inside the department towards orienting the RDT&E, the production processes, sort of driving material solutions to the immediate needs of the warfighter or the near-term needs. I'm encouraged by the level of attention by senior leadership, but they do have a lot of work to do.
I think from a managerial perspective, you need to bring the operators in consistently as you do serial operational prototyping. So in other words, minimal viable product goes out to the warfighter. They test it, look at it, see if it's operationally useful or not, suggest changes, goes back into the process, you prototype again, repeat. And this will be repeating over and over again, and frankly should be repeating over and over again with software changes, with hardware changes. And the key thing that we have right now is this wall that we like to throw things over. And going to Congressman Moulton's idea of embedding, the operator in certain areas is probably a real good one. The question is, how do you do that?
Go ahead. Did you have a comment?
Yeah. So I would say this gets the need for rapid prototyping to be done on a tempo that's much faster than what the DoD is currently planning, which is like 2 or 3 of these events per year. That's not going to get you to where you need to be. And then the problem with the DIU idea of they're going to go procure these vehicles is who's going to actually do the prototyping and the evolution of these vehicles, because DIU is more of a procurement agency, not a integration and R&D type of agency. So I think those are challenges.
Ro, I got one more. I'm sorry, but you're going to like this one.
You're educating me.
Well,
I'm listening to your terms, I'm like, I'm gonna put those in my speeches, make me sound good on defense.
The speeches will put everyone to sleep if you do that. But you'll like this one. So I'll do. Are we in a fourth round now? I don't know. Whatever. I'll just keep asking questions. Okay. So let's say it's January 2025, and the newly elected President Ro Khanna comes to you and says, you know what, I've reviewed the intel, and I think Xi Jinping was serious about this whole I'll take Taiwan by force if necessary, and 2027 is the date. I just think we got to plan against that. And I'm betting the farm, and you are each the Secretary of Defense in this fictional universe, which actually, I mean, there's a probability this could happen. I'm betting the farm on Replicator to prevent this from happening. Like, you as Secretary of Defense, what do you need to make this successful? In simple terms, that the American people can understand. Mr. Clark, we'll start with you.
Well, I tell President Khanna that I think we...
Has a nice ring to it.
It does. So I think we need to quickly get the operators to define how they intend to solve this problem. How would they go about tackling stopping the invasion? And I think it would be a combination of slowing down the invasion with unmanned systems that are going to create the hellscape that Admiral Paparo talks about, and then the joint fires network that's going to be used to then eliminate those ships before they're able to get combat power ashore. So that's the basic construct. What I need is the money to be able to go rapidly buy a bunch of unmanned systems that are going to enable me to gum up the Strait of Taiwan, and then I need to sustain the investment in the munitions production that's going to get me those missiles to be able to eliminate the problem once they've been slowed down.
Thank you.
Three things: money, production lines at full capacity, and then the third area is that we should already be working on is how to deliver these. And so the issue is platforms. Are we going to do these out of P-8s, out of Sonobui, or are we going to do it out of C-130s? Are we going to create a new arsenal plane out of commercial aircraft that's able to deliver these type of things? Same thing undersea and on the surface. We should be thinking about those now and have these platforms ready to go. And in 2025, we should just be cranking up full production lines on all of these things.
Sorry, dumb question to interject. Are the ranges such that you could even have them pre-positioned in like southern Japan, northern Philippines, or does that not work in the same way?
Oh no, it's very feasible.
Yeah.
You could position these in Luzon, in the Sakishima Islands of Japan, or on Taiwan itself.
Interesting. Secretary Shar.
So flexible money, lots of it. And the department's going to need to have a very tightly integrated system of experimenting with these systems to figure out how do you use them effectively, and then what are the upgrades you need. We see in wartime that cycle is measured in weeks and months. We have these very quick innovation cycles. We see it at Ukraine. We saw it effectively for the U.S. and Iraq and Afghanistan with things like counter-IED technologies, where we saw these like very rapid innovation where we'd see the enemy do something, our folks would be innovating in our tactics, in our material solutions, and the department's going to need to have structures to do that that are ready to go ahead of a conflict to be effective.
Any other questions?
It's good. It was very helpful.
Yeah.
Educational.
Thank you very much. This is a very productive discussion. Thanks for your analysis, your expertise, and your continued work on this important issue. And I would like to reiterate our desire and request for the department to come testify on Replicator, ideally the Deputy Secretary, perhaps with the head of DIU.
And I just echo that. I on the Democratic side, we support that.
Great. See, we're very bipartisan. And we all look forward to the Khanna administration fixing all of these problems.
We just need a speaker. Gallagher first, huh?
No comment. Subcommittee hearing stands adjourned.